Life is beautiful, and part of the beauty of it is that it ends. It is an undeniable fact that most, if not all, human cultures have been, in one way or another, obsessed with death. But at some points in history, we as a race and as a society have taken it a step too far. This video will discuss ideas about why the Victorians wanted to look like tuberculosis patients, and why modern-day celebrities are aspiring to look starved. Therefore, we will be analyzing topics of death, weight loss, and eating disorders. If these topics could be triggering to you, I highly recommend that you skip this video and remember one truth. Living is a privilege. Your body might not look the way you'd like to, but at the end of the day, we're alive. We're here, and this is the moment to enjoy the beauty of the world. Take care of yourselves. But before we start, let me introduce myself. Hi, my name is Scarlett, and I am a PhD candidate in literary studies. And this is The Punk Professor, the YouTube channel in which you can find video essays about a variety of topics made by someone who actually enjoys researching and who knows how to do it. So without further ado, let's get into it. Death was part of the everyday life of your average Victorian in a variety of ways. Not a lot was known about diseases, they were still learning about those at the time, and pretty much everything that they used was poisonous, from the very trendy green wallpaper that adorned their houses to the makeup that decorated women's faces, not to talk about the horrors of industrialization. And one of these many horrors that devastated the lives of 19th century British men and women was the illness nowadays known as tuberculosis. Back in the time, this was called the consumption because one of its most visible symptoms was a dramatic weight loss and paleness, as the illness took hold of the body and slowly but surely deteriorated it towards death. In her book Consumptive Chic, A History of Fashion, Beauty and Disease, Caroline Day explains that tuberculosis enhances those things that are already established as beautiful in women, such as the thinness and the pale skin that result from the weight loss and the lack of appetite caused by the disease, alongside the fine, silky hair, dilated and sparkling eyes, and rosy cheeks and red lips, consequence of the high fevers. Because of this, healthy women started attempting to emulate the symptoms of tuberculosis through the use of poisonous white makeup, blush and lipstick, drugs to dilate their pupils, etc., as well as through the use of corsets and wide skirts to accentuate the small size of the waist. But why did Victorian and Romantic women want to look like they were dying? Well, on the one hand, many influential figures of the 19th and 18th century suffered and ultimately died from consumption, such as John Keats, Frederick Chopin, and Emily Bronte. Moreover, as Alicia Hibbard and Annette Lopez Rosa state, Lord Byron once said, "I should like, I think, to die of consumption," because the women would all say, "See, that poor Lord Byron, how interesting he looks dying." There was, as evidenced by Byron's very tone-deaf affirmation, an interesting and romantic element about dying of tuberculosis. This illness back in the time was heavily intertwined with the idea of divine will, as explained by Caroline Day. Day continues to state that death by tuberculosis was understood as an atonement of one's sins, and therefore a quiet acceptance of the illness translated into respect and submission to the will of God. The idea that death by consumption was a peaceful way to go was widely spread during the 18th and 19th century, as exemplified in a letter written by Florence Nightingale, which reads, "Patients who die of consumption very often die in a state of seraphic joy and peace. The countenance almost expresses rapture." While originally this romanticization of the suffering and death of tuberculosis patients wasn't exclusive to any gender, it quickly became a feminine attribute. Jennifer Patterson explains that pain is narrated in a language that is influenced by environments, intersected by time, place, and culture, and it's heavily gendered. In explaining that the different narratives or approaches that society, patients, and doctors have toward terminal illnesses, such as consumption was for Victorians, Patterson mentions the quest narrative, in which the doctor is a hero protecting the patient from a terrible beast, the illness. Being a culture undeniably patriarchal and heterosexual one, the doctor becomes a masculine heroic figure and the patient a maiden in distress, and this subconscious understanding of medicine was especially prevalent in the Victorian times. In the 18th and 19th centuries, Day writes, "Consumption provided one of the main instruments through which femininity was linked to the sort of suffering that was rationalized as both spiritually and morally redemptive. As a result, meaning was given to the illness experience of upper and middle class women. It also supplied yet another way for the women of these classes to distance themselves from the filth, degradation, and related implications that marked the approach to the illness of the lower orders. Tuberculosis, through this medical victimization and romanticization of suffering, becomes an aspirational feminine attribute, as nothing is as attractive, at least in the eyes of patriarchy, as feminine vulnerability. And nothing is as vulnerable as a dying woman. As Edgar Allan Poe writes in his The Philosophy of Composition in 1846, the death, then, of a beautiful woman is unquestionably the most poetical topic in the world. Brenna Mahal explains that this romanticization of the dead feminine body has persisted in part due to the fact that representations of dead female bodies exemplify the feminine ideal, passive, visionless, and voiceless. At the end of the day, a fascination with a womanly death is the only logical conclusion to a society that not only romanticizes but that finds sexual arousal in feminine passiveness and weakness. This notion of beauty as thinness wasn't always prevalent, or even existing. In the years prior to the Victorian era, thickness in women was the standard for attractiveness because it signaled wealth. One didn't lack food to eat, as well as healthiness and a better capacity for childbearing. This idea was abandoned around the 1840s when a Presbyterian minister called Sylvester Graham began advocating for an abstinent diet for women as a sign of self-control and positive Christian morality. While it is true that the idea of thinness being the beautiful thing to be finds many origins, the Industrial Revolution, when having a thin wife who couldn't work in a factory became a bourgeois luxury, also around that same time with the standardization of clothing sizes and the disappearance of the corsets, the discovery of the calorie, etc. This religious notion, however, cannot be ignored. Graham states that spices, stimulants, and other overindulgences lead to indigestions, illness, and sexual excess, and civil disorder. The idea that a thin body was a sign of self-control and therefore good behavior among women became stronger and more widespread as time moved forward. As it happened with victims of tuberculosis being praised for their quiet acceptance of God's punishment, women becoming thinner and thinner became a sign of restriction and obedience to God. No discipline seems pleasant at the time but painful. Later on, however, it produces a harvest of righteousness and peace for those who have been trained by it, as can be read in Hebrews 12:11. But let's go back to the dying women and why they are attractive to society. For upper-class women, the Christian association to tuberculosis became a powerful tool to separate themselves from the lower-class women, whose illness was seen as filthy and a consequence of poor habits. Annabella Boardman, in her article Ideas of Consumption, Divine Fashion, explains that in emulating tuberculosis, women were emulating extremes. Since it was culturally understood that the illness could be acquired through either an excessive dancing or a complete lack thereof, or an excessive use of the corset or complete lack thereof, well, you get the gist. Roman goes on to explain that fashion from the neoclassical era to today has been a way to express social and cultural anxieties by deviating from norms and ideals. Fashion influenced by consumption was a way to show moral superiority in the face of an unknown disease. Heroin chic was a way to express anxieties of consumerism and objectification by the denial of nourishment and an adult figure. The ill and fragile body then is a metaphor for femininity. During the Victorian times, society learned to cope with an illness that was decimating their population through religion. It makes no sense being said that someone is dying of tuberculosis if we believe that that is the will of God, and going even farther, it makes no sense being sad that someone is dying of tuberculosis if we, as a society, come to understand this illness as a fashionable, romantic, and spiritually and aesthetically interesting thing. During the end of the 90s and the 2000s, the heroin chic became very prevalent. Actresses, singers, and models were exhibiting an almost extreme thinness, and I say almost because sadly it kind of pales in comparison to the thinness we're observing nowadays. And this too was representative of a larger social anxiety. As it happened to 18th and 19th century women, modern women's bodies were and still are being used as the field on which social battles are fought. In earlier times, it was the battle between the will to live and the quiet acceptance of God's will. In the 90s, it was the battle between the Christian restriction and the new era of crazy capitalist consumerism. And that's how we get to probably one of my favorite theoretical frameworks, abject theory. Julia Kristeva, born in 1941, is a philosopher, among many other things, who worked on the theory of abjection in her 1980s essay Powers of Horror, an essay on abjection. A perfect example of an abject is a corpse, since it is something that looks exactly like a human being, but there is an unidentified element missing. This incredibly complex theory can be very roughly summarized in the more common concept of uncanny valley, something that looks like a human, but not quite. And that creates an uncomfortable feeling in the observer. Now, why is this relevant? Kristeva explains that the abject, in general terms, represents what is rejected by society, thus drawing a negative picture of what is deemed as acceptable. And she uses this idea to analyze popular cultural narratives of horror and discriminatory behavior like misogyny, homophobia, or racism. As explained by Christine L. Harold, through observing this other, we, the healthy, is enabled to feel clean, vital, and even morally superior. When observing a victim of heroin addiction, for example, a non-addict feels especially healthy and happy with their life decisions. Similarly, I try to argue the female body in relation to its weight exists in a constant balance of abjection. The standard of beauty that can be observed in Botticelli's works, for example, is characterized by abundance and healthiness. These are women who can apparently give life to children without problems and who could even survive a famine. In this context, the abjection is represented by thin women, such as those with tuberculosis. But by observing these sick women and romanticizing their weakness, little by little they become the object instead of the abject, and women with greater weight, the abject. When society stops prioritizing health and begins to romanticize suffering, larger women come to represent the excesses that these poor victims of consumption voluntarily leave behind to approach the kingdom of God. And so, a heteropatriarchal society that, no matter the weight of the body, already regards all women as abject, has glamorized the ultimate expression of abject, the corpse. This way, although beauty standards also affect men more and more as time advances, men get to look at women starving themselves and feel healthier, morally superior, and I'll go as far as saying stronger and more powerful. In an interview conducted by the BBC to Tyrese Osborne, at the time of the interview seemed to be chair of the National Association of Advance Fat Acceptance, the history of the body positivity movement is explained alongside its defeat as social media and capitalism took a hold of it. In this section, I am going to speak about issues concerning the fat community, but also issues concerning people of color. Being myself a thin white woman, I think it is my duty to use the privilege that these labels bring me to speak of these issues. While I want to make clear that I am speaking about the people in these communities from a place of utmost respect, should I say something incorrect, please feel more than welcome to correct me in the comments, as I am more than willing to continue educating myself on these topics. I only ask you to please be kind. The fat right movement started, as Osborne explained, around the 1870s when a young engineer in New York named Bill Fabre became very angry at the way the world was treating his wife, Joyce. After doing some research and individual activism, he gathered a small group of people and founded the National Association to Aid Fat Americans, today's NAAFA. Many oppressed minorities joined this fight, like feminists and LGBTQ people, and by the 1973 they managed to release their Fat Manifesto. However, there was one minority that didn't really receive help from the mainstream fat rights movement: people of color. Apparently, many white activists believe that because black communities and other communities of color seemed to be more accepting of fat people, that meant that fat people of color simply didn't need activism. This, however, was not only a terrible mistake, but also a terrible misunderstanding of the troubles that ethnic minorities suffer when it comes to body positivity. Women are abject, fat people are abject, non-white people are abject. In a society in which the pinnacle of beauty and attraction are white, athletic men, the ultimate form of abjection are black, fat women, not to talk about those who are queer in any way. Due to the physical build that black people have, generally larger than that of other ethnicities, what would be a broad build in a white woman is the standard for a black woman. Then again, generally speaking. This explains why, in the eyes of white people, black communities seem more accepting of bigger-bodied people. Maybe it's because they actually are, or maybe it's because the definition of fat is not universal and it differs among cultures and ethnicities. But I digress. This fate suffered by black people during the fat rights activism would eventually be suffered by the very same fat people that mothered and fathered this movement. How? In the same way in which almost every good thing that we once had came to an end, through the invention of social media. While the body positivity movement continued advancing and making meaningful social changes during the 70s, 80s, and 90s, and even 2000s, when Instagram came to the picture, it all went south. Everyone joined the movement, but the problem became that pictures of normative bodies with hashtag body positive, hashtag body love, etc. began drowning the very same pictures with the very same hashtags, but that depicted fat bodies or bodies that differed from the norm in other ways. And as we, as a society, forgot of this movement and its very important purpose. As the 2010s and 2020s advanced, body positive became another word for obsessed with health. And of course, being healthy became a synonym for being thin. And this might seem to be in contradiction with what has been previously stated about dying and therefore being as unhealthy as one can get, women being more attractive to the general public. But it really isn't. The body positivity movement always came hand in hand with the notion of maintaining a healthy body. It was never quite obviously about eating Burger King every day, but rather about reinforcing the idea that healthy bodies come in different sizes and that, also quite obviously, having an unhealthy body really is not a moral failing. But in social media, that was lost to the public, and those same social organisms that glorified death by tuberculosis, that is the church, the patriarchy, conservatism, glorified the thin body as the ultimate expression of self-care and health. The healthier the body, the more self-restraint that person showed. The more restrained the woman, the prettier she is. And so, Ozempic came out as a way to help everybody look as thin as death. While Ozempic was first approved by the FDA in 2017, back in the time it was only used to treat type 2 diabetes as it lowered blood sugar. One thing linked to another, and by 2022 it was being prescribed as a weight loss medicine not only to those who really needed to lose weight for actual health reasons, but to anyone who could pay it. So basically, when overweight people with normal bodies, and especially the women in these groups, decided to focus on self-love, self-care, and health, what society did was rebrand these ideas to make women aspire to what patriarchy wants them to aspire, being as small as possible, and ideally, as quiet as a corpse. In conclusion, in the Victorian times, the beauty ideal took the form of a dying woman because she was quietly and obediently submitting to the will of God. Almost 200 years later, in 2026, emaciated bodies are being praised for their Christ-like restriction, discipline, and self-control. But one thing remains a constant. A woman occupying space, making her own decisions about her own future and body, and being loudly and proudly herself, will always be an enemy. And so that was it for this video. I really hope you enjoyed it. If you like these types of video essays, please give me a follow. It would help me so much to keep myself motivated to make these videos. You can also follow me on my other social media. You've got TikTok, Instagram, and Substack. You can find all of them in the little box down here. And thank you so much for watching. See you guys next time. Bye bye.